One thing that I wanted to say, we were at dinner last night and we were reflecting upon the conference, and my reflection upon the conference and what gives me hope is the compassion that is coming through in all of these presentations. From Justin this morning, was his name Nathan, who actually shook President Obama's hand, to the enthusiasm with which Brian just discussed the Liftware project. And I actually have some insight into Nathan Intrator and Brian Johnson's presentations, which I think are actually going to move all of us as well. So Nathan Intrator is our next presenter. He is the co-founder of Neurosteer, a mobile cloud-based platform that uses advanced signal processing and big data analytics to manage brain health. He is on leave from Tel Aviv University, where he is a professor of computer science and neuroscience. He has more than 140 peer-reviewed publications in neural computation, machine learning, and pattern recognition. Today he's going to focus on epilepsy, AI, and digital signal processing.
Thank you. So it is a great pleasure to be here. And I thank Brian for talking about diabetes a lot, because I'm going to try and connect between diabetes and what we need to do with the brain. So DSP is digital signal processing. We'll get to that. All right, so a little bit of statistics about epilepsy. 1 out of 26, that's like a huge number, talking about more than 60 million in the United States. What's most important in these statistics is the child, the fact that this is the most important brain disorder for children. And we can then imagine that as a brain disorder for children, this is causing brain developmental disorders, which we will go into. So given the fact that this is the most common disease, it turns out that in terms of money for research, there's like 1/7 or 1/10 the funding for research into the neurodegenerative disorders, and that's quite a problem. Now, if we combine that with the fact that there's lack of neurologists, which are quite needed for this problem, and if we go to the third world in this case, then the staggering result is that in many countries in Africa, there's less than 10 neurologists in the whole country, okay? So obviously nobody's going to actually be able to do any kind of monitoring for these patients, or actually diagnostics. In some countries, the number of deaths is more than 8 times larger than in the wealthier countries. And this is just really the small issue with the disease. Why? Because this disease is highly associated with brain developmental disorders, okay? So we are talking about between 16 to 50% reduction in performance for students, for kids at school as a result of epilepsy. And this is not talking about the social issues that are associated with epilepsy. So if that is the case, let's look at maybe other diseases that are common with children and see how they are associated with brain disorders. So this paper connects between epilepsy and autism. We know we are talking about the huge rise in autism in the last several years, but it turns out that there's a strong connection between the two diseases. In 2008, it was estimated at 20%. 2014, already much higher. Let's look at this even more. So if we are talking about brain developmental disorders in general for kids, then this is like an amazing statistics to me, that 1 out of 6 kids suffers from some kind of brain developmental disorder, okay? And if we could detect that early, if we could respond to it early, we could potentially improve on it a lot. And we are involved in the attempt to detect autism around 4 months where it can actually be addressed quite nicely. Until now, usually autism is detected around the age of 5, where it is kind of too late to do something. Sometimes it's detected at the age of 2, where there's more that can be done, but at the age of 4 months, it's much, much better. So maybe some of these diseases are associated with epilepsy as well. Yeah. And let's go into this. Give me some volume here.
I'd like to tell you about one such child whose story was also covered by ABC News. 7-year-old Justin Senegal came to our clinic with this diagnosis of very severe autism. Like many autistic children, his mind was locked inside his body. There were moments when he would actually space out for seconds at a time. And the doctors told his parents he was never going to be able to communicate or interact socially, and he would probably never have too much language. When we used this groundbreaking EEG technology to actually look at Justin's brain, the results were startling. It turned out that Justin was almost certainly not autistic. He was suffering from brain seizures that were impossible to see with the naked eye, but that were actually causing symptoms that mimicked those of autism. After Justin was given anti-seizure medication, the change in him was amazing. Within a period of 60 days, his vocabulary went from 2 to 3 words to 300 words, and his communication and social interaction
improved dramatically. Okay, so this, I guess you could continue this by yourself. Okay, so this is kind of staggering. So what the story here is that the epilepsy of this Justin did not have, thank you very much, yes, there's a pointer here. Thank you. I appreciate it, you come with your own kit, thank you, perfect. Okay, I'm gonna need it soon. He did not have seizure convulsions, so it was not obvious that he has seizures, and therefore nobody could think that he is suffering from epilepsy. But if he was monitored, then apparently epilepsy was very evident, okay? And treating that apparently improved dramatically. So if we understand this and take it further, let's go now into a little bit of details, okay? So here's an arrow of what's called spikes in the EEG, and now that I see Bob Knight here, I guess some people are very familiar with these kind of things. I have 2 points about that, because some of you AI guys are saying this, what's a big deal? I mean, we can run our AI machine and find that right away. We'll talk about that. But the point I want to make to Bob Knight and others here, that this is really not showing the true picture, okay? The true picture is in the depth of the ink of these lines, okay? So the true picture is really in a very, very minute signal that is of higher frequency that is being unseen in this presentation. And that's something that I've been trying to advocate for quite a long time, okay? So, okay, can we do it with AI? First question, and I guess most of you will say yes. Let's dwell on this a little bit. We see that, oh, yes, AI in machine learning in medicine is a big deal. Zebra Medical here, some others doing genomics. So vision, namely radiology, genomics, etc., seems to be working very well. So it's kind of natural that we will have AI trying to do epilepsy detection or epilepsy prediction. We are talking about 21 electrodes here. So we don't really want to walk in the street with 21 electrodes. We want to have something minimal. When we are going for something minimal, this is Natus, that's one of the companies that's doing this, then the results go dramatically lower, okay? And these are the results. You can look at this FDA application that was approved in 2015 of Natus using 4 EEG channels, 5 electrodes altogether. 23 neurologists using 21 electrodes detected 635 seizures. In the automatic algorithm, they detected 285 seizures, kind of about 1/3 of the number of seizures. And now, again, I'm talking about seizures and not about pre-ictal activity, that very important activity that precedes a seizure. And they were cleared by FDA, kind of suggesting that the problem is, one, problematic, very big, and there's yet no solution. And any solution that can reduce the need for neurologists is going to be accepted. Going back to what Vinod Khosla mentioned yesterday, I said that a lot of people do not know that they have a heart problem until they get a heart attack. Okay, so taking this to epilepsy, a lot of people do not know that they have abnormal epileptic activity in their brain until they get a seizure. And we believe that this is really the case. And what I presented at the beginning was that. And so managing epilepsy by the seizures is kind of like managing heart problems by heart attacks, by measuring, oh, you didn't get a heart attack, so you must be fine, kind of like that. Why is it more difficult than the vision problems that we seem to be solving? You know, companies are saying that they are doing much better than radiologists these days, etc. Because in vision, in computer vision and computer graphics, we understood a lot about the invariances that those pictures have, and we are able to capture them. So we can detect a chair here and there, and at this size, and at that orientation, etc. When we go to one-dimensional signal, apparently there's room to improve. Let's see how much room to improve. Let me introduce you to my informal colleagues. All these animals are dealing with one-dimensional signal analysis and are performing far better than humans, okay? So we have the dolphin that is doing sonar or ultrasound under the water and performing about 100 times better than the ultrasound that we are using to, say, detect fetal problems. In the air, we have the sonar bat that is performing sonar with. So, you know, let's talk about the sonar bat, okay? We're talking about a brain that has smaller than the numbers of transistors in 2 generations back of Intel processors. The energy consumption is about 2 millworms a day. And the calculations that they do in real time is much better than if we took kind of Google's cloud and connected it to an electricity workstation and tried to do the calculations. Molret does the same with infrasound under the ground. Elephants do it on top of the ground. They have seismic sensors in their legs, and they can detect earthquakes, and they actually communicate between them. And the conductor will will get to him soon. Okay, so this conductor has to be able to hear the whole orchestra with 1 or 2 ears. Okay, and that turns out to be a very, very complicated problem. Henry Markram is actually comparing the brain to what he calls a 1 million note grand piano. And let's try to understand where he's taking that from. So we have here neurons. We have a chorus of 10 billion neurons or more. Okay, each one is producing a little bit of electrical activity. But they're not just talking in random. There are several populations of neurons, and this is what he talks about, 1 million of those. Okay, populations of neurons that are active together. Okay, so kind of like, you know, the violins are playing all together, the celli are playing together, etc. And the idea is to do what the conductor does, namely to be able to hear each one of them separately. And that is a very, very strong, difficult signal processing, one-dimensional signal processing technology. And the invariances that I mentioned in computer vision are actually put here on this slide, as in the last 2 two publications that we have. No, the last, before I mentioned deep learning, just to put kind of timing here, but the wavelet packet analysis too. These technologies that are quite recent in terms of history have not yet propagated enough into EEG analysis. I kind of claim here that EEG is one of the most complicated signals that is ever being produced, and you can imagine that 10 billion neurons or 80 billion neurons are actually producing a very complicated music. And people are still doing EEG analysis with Fourier transform, okay, which was invented 250 years ago. So doing something that was invented 30 years ago is not so bad, okay? So that's really what we are trying to introduce into EEG analysis. And let's go now into real time. So when we were talking about diabetes, we said, oh yeah, once we monitor diabetes in real time, we can actually manage the disease. And 10 years ago, we did not monitor it in real time. We did not really, were not able to manage it. Okay, so this is a sub-case of epilepsy. This is what's called a post-trauma epilepsy. And there's about 50,000 such cases every day in the US. And those people will be in the ICU about 5 to 7 days. And it's extremely important to monitor their potential epilepsy as a result of the trauma, because that epilepsy is actually causing more damage to the brain than the original trauma. And it's really important to respond right away, to respond in real time. The current state of the art is 21 electrodes with a neurologist, because the AI kind of state of the art that I mentioned before is not good enough to detect what is needed. There are no neurologists over the weekend, and the literature says that those people that are unfortunate to be hospitalized over the weekend have 20% higher chance to die. So this is a very, very, very serious problem. This is what we are offering instead. This little sensor to be put on the forehead with a little wearable hardware to attach to it. Data going to the cloud. So we are doing DSP, okay? We are doing this kind of signal analysis before we apply AI on top of this data to produce biomarkers that can really replace the spikes and the other features that are being found in EEG into simple numbers from 0 to 100 if there is a lack of consciousness, level of depression on one hand, level of anesthesia on the other hand, and level of pre-ictal activity or potential seizures. Okay. Let's look at some slides now in the last few minutes to kind of see that in this new representation that is based on this wavelet packet analysis, suddenly pre-ictal activity and seizures look very, very different than how they look in the previous picture that I presented. So now this is the time for the pointer. So in this representation, we decompose the signal into 120 channels, what we call 120 brain activity functions, kind of like the chorus of the orchestra or the orchestra that is being decomposed from a single ear. And there are certain regions, so we reorder them. There's the cognitive region, emotional region. Don't ask me now, I'm not going to go into it too much. There's this executive region, which is very important, and I'll mention later. And there are the extreme regions that have to do with stress and pain. And I'm going to switch right away into epilepsy. In the case of epilepsy, suddenly we see activity in one channel that is constant over time, as if someone is ignoring the conductor or is continuing to play for a long time. And you see these lines, and you see that they stop, and you see this spike, and it says pain. So we actually see exactly when it starts and when it stops. And we can look at a few others. This is 14 hours of a patient. And you see these lines here, and then they stop for a while. He's getting a medication, and then they start again. This patient, unfortunately, is getting 5 different medications. And I asked the doctor to separate between them to find out that actually the simplest medication is actually helping and the other medications don't help. You cannot see that in any other way. Another case of same idea, and you may ask me, well, how do you know that this is pre-ictal activity, which is a valid question. So here's a seizure, okay? Here's how a seizure can look, 2 seizures here. Here's how a seizure can look in this representation. Suddenly, activity along many functional neural networks or many regions in the brain, okay? And we can see this pre-ictal activity preceding the seizure, okay? Well, there's another slide here about pain. And you may ask, well, okay, if you actually record continuously, maybe you can see the effect of the anti-epileptic drug. And the answer is yes. The answer is yes. So here we see a patient. Notice that a certain region here is missing in terms of activity. We'll get to that in a second. You see that here the response to stimulation in the cognitive area is much weaker than the response before. This is after valproic acid, after an anti-epileptic drug. We don't see pre-ictal activity here. So in this case, we do see pre-ictal activity. And then we see that after the application of anti-epileptic drug, both the activity, the brain activity went down, but also the pre-ictal activity went down, which is kind of what we are hoping. So we can really see that we can manage the pre-ictal activity. I mentioned that there was a certain area there missing, that executive area, and that has to do with what Phil mentioned yesterday about the thalamus. We are dealing a lot with comatose patients, and it turns out that with comatose patients, this area is missing in terms of activity quite often. Professor Martin Monti from UCLA has a lot of studies together with Professor Stephen Laris that we work with about suggesting that it is the thalamus. He actually was able to wake up one comatose patient by stimulating with ultrasound directly into the thalamus. So this is what we are bringing. We are bringing this kind of technology that makes the rest kind of trivial and to be used in general for EEG monitoring. I'm going to skip this. I wanted to kind of end with something a little more relaxing. So we are doing BCI with an ALS patient. He's moving this Bluetooth ball by thinking. He cannot do it from the motor cortex because the motor cortex is not functioning. So he's doing it from the frontal lobe, and that's kind of interesting. And I'll stop here. Thank you. Sure.
With your 3-electrode sensor, are you able to get the whole cortex?
The frontal part. Less interesting. That's a very noisy area. You know, we don't care about it. We care about the decision area, the emotional areas. We do collect them, yes.
But it's enough to do BCI. Like with only 3 electrodes, you can do BCI.
So it's actually one EEG channel, which is the difference between 2 electrodes, and the third one is reference. Absolutely enough. Yes.
So this is amazing to take out of the lab into everyday environments, and it seems. And so how do you handle interference and the lack of shielding when you're out and about in kind of people's living rooms using this?
It doesn't bother us.
It doesn't matter because it's different.
I'm a mathematician, so we would say this is a signal with the different properties, different stochastic properties. It doesn't bother us. We don't filter. This is old story filter. Yeah. Yes.
If the electrodes can be smaller, but you can still get the same signal to noise, will you get more information compared to larger electrodes?
I don't need to get more information, but then the whole wearable sensor will be easier to use, simpler, etc. That's why I'm approaching you for sensors. But
Small electrodes, maybe you can focus on smaller sets of neurons.
So the folklore is that EEG is collecting data from a very small vicinity of the electrodes. This is not entirely true. Okay, what is true is that the signal does decay. So signal that is far from the electrode does get to that electrode, but is much weaker. Okay, so the location, the exact location of the electrode is not so important. Okay, what is important is to analyze the data with a very wide dynamic range kind of sensor, which we developed our own hardware for this in order to be able to do that. Okay.
Last question, Vivian. What do you exactly mean by emotional channels? How do you define those?
So we have a bunch of people watching movies, and there's a happy part in the movie and frightening part in the movie and sad part in the movie, and we see that the activity is then being shifted to different regions in that emotional area. So we can detect that this is a frightening part in the movie.
So you combine this with the wavelength analysis?
Of course.
Okay.
Cool. All right. Thank you very much.